This presentation was recorded at MVC Conf. For more content like this, go to www.mvcconf.com. JetBrains, the leading vendor of professional development tools, now offers a range of new products for .NET developers. In addition to ReSharper, the top-class productivity extension for Visual Studio, you can now use .cover to run coverage analysis for your applications, .trace to find performance bottlenecks, and use TeamCity and UTrack for a perfect combination of continuous integration and issue tracking software. Go to www.jetbrains.com for more information.
Folks, we'll go ahead and get going. I know Todd's ready. Hopefully everybody else is ready. So without any further ado, I am going to introduce my good friend and just awesome supporter of community, Todd Anglin. Todd, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, everyone, for sticking with us here as we head into the near afternoon hours here in Central Time for MVC Conf. And the session that we have today for this next slot is talking about the open source and free Telerik extensions for ASP.NET MVC. So this is a look at tools that Telerik builds and provides in the open source space to help you build rich MVC views. And that's really where the topic comes from, creating rich MVC views, because as we move into this MVC era of building ASP.NET applications, we're still faced with the challenge as web developers of how do we provide the rich functionality that our users have already grown to expect. So we'll be addressing how you can do that with the extensions today. Before we get there, just a couple of plugs for who I work for, and I guess we'll be kind of talking about that in general today. If you're not already engaged with Telerik on Facebook or on Twitter, please go ahead and join us there, facebook.com/Telerik or twitter.com/Telerik if you're on Twitter. Great places to keep up with our latest release news. So when we do ship new extensions, and in the case of the extensions, we do have a release coming up very soon. There's some beta bits out there now that will be going official, so you want to plug in there to get those announcements. Otherwise, a few introductions. As Zane said, I am Todd Anglin, and I do work for Telerik and Chief Evangelist there. Also a Microsoft MVP, President of the North Houston .NET User Group, an O'Reilly author. And if you want to find me online, I blog most often at telericwatch.com. And I imagine a lot of today's audience probably is on Twitter as well. So if you're on Twitter, then I'm there at Todd Anglin. And some of you may prefer to share traffic updates. I don't. It's a strictly business feed. So if you want the occasional links to interesting resources, especially for web development, which is where my expertise exists, then join me on Twitter. So that's who I am. Who Telerik is my one slide that I usually just describe who I work for, and I'll just toss it in here so you understand the big picture of what Telerik's doing today. We're really working hard to be an all-in-one provider for .NET developers, so that as a .NET developer, when you sit down to work on a project, you've got all the tools, all the components that you need to get from planning to release. So that means on the UI side, UI components not only for ASP.NET Ajax, where we began, but also for ASP.NET MVC, which we're looking at today. And then WinForms, of course, the XAML platform with Silverlight and WPF. On the tool side, that means reporting, open access, ORM for your data access needs. JustCode and JustMock are also on here listed in two separate categories. In fact, hopefully some of you were able to join us for our big JustCode, JustMock webinar about an hour ago where we gave away free licenses to both of those to all the attendees. Had great attendance there. Hopefully some of you were able to grab a license. And then on the testing side, WebUI Test Studio for automating the process of making sure your applications behave the way you expect them to. Very intuitive recorder to do that. And for managing the project. So going back further in the software lifecycle to how you actually capture your ideas and manage your software development, we have the two free tools. So if you're a TFS shop now, these are two tools you should download right away because they are perpetually free. The Work Item Manager and the Project Dashboard. Work Item Manager helps you improve, let's just say, the process of working with TFS work items more than what the default Visual Studio tools provide. And Project Dashboard is a great thing to throw up on a big project, team project screen. We use this on a big screen in our office here, and it's a great thing to visualize velocity and various metrics coming out of TFS as you work on constructing software. My favorite widget on that is who broke the last build. Their big picture goes up on the screen, and obviously they get to buy the next round for everybody. And Team Pulse, a brand new product from Telerik launching next week, in fact Tuesday, a week from this past Tuesday, so only a few days now, will be the official launch, and everybody who attends that event next week will get a free standard license to Teampulse, which is an agile team or agile project management tool, so I encourage you to check that out. So all in all, Telerik is obviously covering a lot of things, all under the umbrella of how do we make .NET software development teams more productive so you can ship higher quality software. And certainly that remains true for MVC, but in the MVC front, we're really embracing MVC in the pattern in which MVC exists, or the area in which MVC exists, which is obviously open source and community driven. So how are we going to go through today's content? What's the order of operations? We're going to start with a little bit of origins of MVC. Obviously, if you're attending today's conference, I expect that you already have a pretty solid foundation on the origins of MVC, but it's important to set the stage for why do we have to go about now coming up with a new way to make rich views for the web, because certainly this is not the first time that's been done, so we'll establish that. I'll provide a quick introduction to the Telerik extensions so you understand what they are, and then we'll jump into Visual Studio, show you how to get started, show you some of the various extensions that are in today's toolbox, how do you work with them, what are the important features you probably want to be aware of, and then we'll wrap up with a quick look at the licensing and the roadmap for the open source extensions. I know there are some questions around what is the open source license, how does that work, so we'll make sure we get that answered. And, of course, any questions you have, make sure you're logging them today in the question manager, and we'll try our best to save some time for the end to answer those questions. In fact, I'll try to wrap up a little bit early because I know the keynote is next. We want to make sure we get you there on time. So we'll try to wrap up early so that we can spend some time with your questions. My main goal today, if we accomplish what we set out to accomplish, is that you will understand what's in this MVC toolbox, so you can go download it today either from Codeflex or from telerik.com and try it out in your MVC projects without some sort of fear that you won't know how to get started. So that's what we're aiming to accomplish. If you forget everything else and you remember that or you can do that, we'll have succeeded. A slight warning, I don't expect it to be a problem for today's conference again, but I imagine there are probably some people here today just getting their feet wet in ASP.NET MVC, trying to figure out if that's the right tool for you. Maybe you're coming from ASP.NET Web Forms, maybe from a non-.NET platform. This session does assume some basic amount of knowledge of MVC. We're not covering MVC basics, but hopefully things will be clear enough if you know .NET, regardless, that you'll be able to follow along when we start looking at the extensions. So the question I like to ask when we talk about ASP.NET MVC and building rich views for ASP.NET MVC is, how did we get here? How did we get to this point in the evolution of web development that we need these ASP.NET, or that we need ASP.NET MVC, and then on top of that, the MVC extensions? If we were to roll back the clock and look to the very beginning, really what we would find in that time machine is this, the beginning of the Internet. And if I could see your hands and poll you, I'd ask, do you know where this comes from? But I'll go ahead and tell you in this context, this is the original web page. This is from Tim Berners-Lee's web server, running on his little server under his desk. This is what the original web page looked like. So we've come quite a ways, but if we were to look at the code to this web page, we'd actually discover that it's not so unfamiliar. We'll see in a minute. Meanwhile, the web has evolved. So we started there with very basic links, basic text. But through the years, websites have gotten richer, and users' expectations have shifted to adapt to that. So here's an example of Microsoft.com through the years, from 1995 to somewhere around 1999, 2000, all the way up to 2008. You can see how the presentation evolved to a richer state. Same goes for whitehouse.gov, not .com. Be careful. We evolved from the 1995-96 version of the website, which was basically just a press release lookup form, to one of my favorite eras of web design with the little animated GIF flags flapping in the wind and a pleasant website giving us a good evening greeting. But we have evolved even past that into the modern era where even now a government website, whitehouse.gov, is a very rich visual presentation. And one a little bit closer to home, Telerik, which has really been around since 2002, since the beginning of .NET. Even in our history, we've evolved from a more basic images and text presentation to something that is richer, more immersive, and certainly more functional if we were able to actually interact with this. So websites have evolved in a rich sense. They've gotten richer, they've gotten more involved, but if we were to peel back that pretty face and look under the covers, often we'd find that the code behind them kind of went a different direction. So on the top here, the then portion, we see the actual near complete markup from the original web page, from Tim Berners-Lee's original web page. It looks pretty familiar, so we can see that a lot of what he had there, the HTML syntax, has survived through the specs and through the iterations of HTML to what we know today, but it's very basic, it's very semantic, we could say. The tags describe the content, and there's not a lot of extraneous markup in this document. Now, however, especially if we were to look at ASP.NET Web Forms generated content, we see a lot more, let's say, garbage, or at the very least things that don't seem to add a lot of value to the presentation we're rendering. This small snippet which we see on the below portion of this screen actually comes from MSDN, and if you notice, I actually wasn't even able to copy and show via pasting anything outside of the head section of the document. We couldn't even get into the content. There was so much being linked to, and we got these long encoded strings to find these web resources, these embedded assemblies, and if we were to get even deeper in a document, we'd find all these hidden fields, all the stuff that's been done to make it more productive for us to build websites, to save us time by simulating state on the web or giving us, in the case of web resources, the ability to embed things. We don't have to keep up with files, but has made our HTML less pretty, or at the very least, less compact and less semantic. Meanwhile, while all that's happening down on the page, we've got pretty face, we've got the ugly behind code. Up on top of the pages, there's been another evolution happening up in the URLs. If we were to look at URLs from websites even 5, 10 years ago, maybe even less than that, we would probably not be surprised to find URLs that look like this, mywebsite.com/page.aspx, and we've got some query string values, kind of cryptic, doesn't mean much to us. Maybe on a blog website, we see that there's an ID, which makes no sense to us for displaying a blog post. Things that were not, or URLs rather, that were not usable. These usable URLs were functional, but not an usable part of the website. Today, though, especially with things like ASP.NET 4 and ASP.NET 3.5 and .NET's routing framework in general, it's much more common to find URLs that look like this, that communicate value, that are usable. In fact, usability studies suggest that even non-power users, let's say, understand that a URL is a functional piece of a website, and they expect to be able to use that to get around if they get stuck. So now on a products website, we'd more expect to see /products/shoes. No file extension. The idea that we ever had to convince users to type in a file extension to load a page is obviously crazy, so websites often today don't require that. On a blog website, we go further to embed information in the URL that helps with indexing, that helps communicate additional information or value directly through the URL, in this case, such as the date of the blog post. So we would say, probably we could agree, that web URLs have gotten better through the years. So we want to achieve then, the ideal world is combining the best. We want to clean our HTML up. We don't want all that junk. We want it to be as semantic as possible. We want to have control. And we want the clean URLs that we have from today. So the code from yesterday, so to speak, and the URLs of today. And that's really important for a lot of reasons, but there's one very critical reason in which we strive for this, why we make the effort. And I would let you guess, and I'll let you ponder, but the answer is very, very clear once you arrive at it. This guy showed up in 1997, 1998, reinvented, or let's say kicked off in a major way, how users go about finding information on the web. Google and its indexers read your content, index it, and then basically if you're not indexed well, your content's not found. And if you think this is only true for external websites, many of you probably are in a corporate environment where you have an internal indexer, an intranet indexer that is also exposing content to your company's users. So being friendly to indexers is a very important reason to have clean URLs and clean HTML that indexes well. But obviously there are lots of other values such as faster page load times, saving bandwidth by not shipping unnecessary characters. All those things roll into it, but this is probably one of the most value-driven reasons. So how does this all connect to ASP.NET and ultimately ASP.NET MVC? Because certainly now we can understand why we're striving for this ideal. We can see why some web frameworks out there have been very popular towards this end. With ASP.NET, the connection is that around the time of the cleaner code, uglier URLs we were describing before, we were dealing largely with ASP Classic. ASP Classic, of course, an add-on originally to IAS. I think IAS 2 was part of a service pack to give us the ability to finally have something dynamic rendering from a Microsoft web server. But ASP Classic, as we know, requires you to essentially do everything manually, everything by hand. So even something as simple as posting back the page and collecting the values and doing any kind of validation, if you were an ASP Classic programmer like I was, you know that that required a fair amount of manual code. You had to create your own check variable to see if it was a post back to the same page, and you had to then repopulate fields if there was an error so that the field entries on a validation error didn't just disappear. And I'm sure we've all seen a few websites that have made that mistake. So that's where we were with ASP Classic. We were kind of playing this game through 3 versions of ASP Classic of doing a lot of things by hand. So the pendulum then with ASP.NET swung way to the other direction, from doing everything by hand to letting the server do almost everything for us. In fact, with ASP.NET and web forms for the better part of the last 8 years, we've been more or less convinced that you shouldn't have to write JavaScript when you create websites. We've been more or less convinced that you shouldn't have to write HTML when you create websites, which the fundamental underlying technologies that make websites work, standards-based websites at least, are HTML, JavaScript, and then, of course, CSS. So all of that was abstracted away from us through this server control model. So we got very far away from what it is that's happening on the page that's sent to our users. And as a result, we became blind, or at least it was very easy to not pay attention to all the content, all the markup. And so we probably went too far, or we could say we went too far if we're not being careful, towards letting the server do things in an unoptimized way in an effort to save us time as developers. So with ASP.NET MVC, it's about swinging the pendulum back to the middle. It's not about going back to ASP Classic. It's about giving us that right balance between doing things by hand, doing things that allow us to have the right amount of control, while still taking advantage of things that can save us time, because certainly we're not going back to the dark ages. We just want more control so that we can be better web developers. So ASP.NET MVC. Today, to achieve that balance, that pendulum swing, we often are faced with this, at least theoretical trade-off, this MVC trade-off question. Do I want to be productive, or do I want clean rendering that we've described here? And I put productive in quotes because I'm not trying to suggest that you're not productive with ASP.NET MVC. In fact, there are many hardcore MVC developers that would suggest you are way more productive with MVC than web forms, let's say, because of all the things that help you with testing and the things that can make you long-term productive as a developer. But when I say productive here, I typically mean when I sit down to write a project, how much do I have to write by hand and how much is being done for me so that I can move on to the things that actually create value for my project, that domain logic. So with today in MVC, there is this kind of out-of-the-box trade-off question, productivity versus clean rendering. And so to you, the question would be then, and I would have created a poll and asked you so we could see your responses, but we'll skip that for now for the sake of time. But in your head, answer, is ASP.NET MVC about writing everything by hand? True or false? And if you spend enough time around the blogs and searching, you might come away with the conclusion that ASP.NET MVC is about writing everything by hand. You're seeing examples hoisted out there that suggest a grid in MVC is a for each loop, repeating things and writing table rows, which technically you can build a table that way. But MVC was never about writing everything by hand, in my opinion. MVC was what we just described, about giving you a balance in control versus doing things manually. So where the telerik extensions for MVC entered the scene, and this helps us cross the bridge into our actual MVC extensions and demos, is we're aiming to bring back that, again, in quotes, productivity to MVC. We're aiming to strike that correct balance between what do I need to do by hand and what can I rely on tools to help me do. And we want to do it all in a way without violating the so-called principles of MVC. And there are a number of principles that we might be able to describe and encapsulate, but some of them are listed here below. So one of the principles of MVC clearly up front is testability. We want to be able to have testable web applications. Now, I'm almost certain, because I've done talks like this before in audiences around the world, that I could poll you now and ask you, and if you were being honest, how many of you are actually testing your applications? And I imagine there are some of you, and I congratulate you, and that is a good behavior, but I imagine the majority of you still are not. So let's be very clear. Testability is only an advantage if you're testing. Now, of course, it's good to have it there so you can move towards that, and I would encourage you to for the benefits that testing provides. But we do embrace testability with the telerik extensions because it is one of the core ideas of the MVC platform. Now, it's just up to you to use it. Clean HTML is another important idea. That is, not rendering all of these hidden fields, not relying on some sort of bulky encoded strings for simulating state, all these things that create trouble traditionally in web forms. We don't want to see that in MVC. We want clean HTML, semantic HTML, and if you're not familiar with the term, semantic HTML simply means the tags describe the content. So if I'm using HTML5, if I have a header tag, my content should be just header content. If I have a P tag or paragraph tag, it should just be paragraph text. So we want to have this semantic description between our rendering and the tags we use. We also want to have as much control over that as HTML as possible, which is sort of catty corner box to what we just talked about. And that's another thing that we try to embrace as much as possible in telerik extensions. We want to do some things automatically for you because you don't want to do everything by hand, that's what we've established, but you also want to have control where you need it. Some foundational information. The telerik extensions for ASP.NET and MVC are in fact built on jQuery. jQuery is the foundational client-side framework for the extensions, not the Microsoft Ajax libraries. Obviously, with Microsoft's official stance having already shifted on the Ajax libraries, this is a logical choice. But jQuery also allows us to take advantage of all jQuery's features and API approaches for how we build out the extensions as well. So what you'll find when you work with the extensions client-side model, it's very much working with any other client-side, let's say, jQuery plugin. Control IDs are something that we want to have absolute control over, obviously, because as web developers embracing the idea of what good web development is, we don't want to be afraid of JavaScript. JavaScript is what we should be embracing. So we need that clean control ID approach. We need view engine agnostic tools as well, because as we can see with ASP.NET and MVC, not all view engines are created equal, and certainly not everybody prefers one view engine over another. In fact, with Microsoft's recent announcement, release of the beta of the Razor syntax, which will eventually find its way into ASP.NET and MVC, we recognize even more clearly now the value for having tools that do work across view engines. And the way the telerik extensions have been built are exactly with that in mind, working across multiple view engines. And finally, and most importantly perhaps for today's conversation, and why we can talk about this as part of MVC Conf, is because these are open source tools. These are available on Codeplex. You can download the source. If they don't do something you like today, as is with open source, change it. Fix it to fit your needs. And we'll discuss exactly how the open source license is structured at the end. And I would flash on the screen right here a big message saying these are not wrappers around web form controls, but I'll just say it emphatically so you remember it. These are not wrappers around web forms controls. These are natively built MVC extensions. These are built from the ground up for ASP.NET MVC and embracing all the things that our development team has learned over the years building tools for web forms. So that's to say, as a professional UI component company building web forms for years and years and years, we learned a lot of the lessons about what makes it easy or hard to support these kinds of tools, and we're taking that knowledge, the best of it, and baking it into these new controls so that you have something that is very robust, even from the early versions. So can you use web forms controls in MVC? If you're not familiar, yes, you can. It's some level familiar at least. You can use familiar controls, familiar properties, familiar behaviors, but you are often bringing forward a lot of the so-called evil concepts, at least within the MVC space, when you do that, be it either some sort of hidden approach on the server towards view state, or even enabling the view state in the page if you go to the runout server. So then how are the telerik extensions built up? What do you need to work with the telerik extensions for MVC? Obviously, the underlying portion of the pyramid is .NET Framework 3.5 Plus, so you need to be working with basically the platform that supports ASP.NET MVC to begin with. So if you're on .NET 2.0 in your organization, you're probably not on MVC anyway, so just keep that in mind. 3.5, MVC, and then right on top of MVC sits the telerik extension framework, which really provides the server-side Fluent API, and that's what makes the telerik extensions unique, let's say, when compared to something like client-side tools, in that they provide both a server and client-side model, a server and client-side Fluent API, which allows you to have some unique advantages, which we'll talk about in a second. So we obviously also need jQuery, because we build on jQuery, and then the extensions built on top of the telerik framework. There are now, I believe, 8, maybe even 12 of them now. We'll look at them as we go here. And a couple of non-visual extensions, the web asset managers, which help you with optimizing web resources. We'll be talking more about those really in the next session day at 2 p.m., in addition to a lot of other web optimization concepts. So I mentioned it, so let me provide just sort of the points you can make notes and remember. When you're comparing something like the Telerik extensions for MVC to JavaScript UI components, so these could be things like jQuery UI components, which are great tools, and I often use them in projects. It's important to just recognize where they have advantages and disadvantages. So with JavaScript components, the challenges often are that they're ad hoc. That means you usually find one guy who makes this really great and another individual or another person who makes this really great, but there's no just complete toolbox that is guaranteed and tested to work together. So you have to do a lot of piecemeal finding tools that work, which is fine if you have the time, but sometimes not the most suitable way to spend your time as a developer. Now, the advantage, of course, is they're prolific. You can find a JavaScript UI component for just about anything, so it's really handy to go find these and use them in your project to save you time. And, of course, there's no dependency on .NET. So if you're not working on an ASP.NET MVC project or a .NET project, your next, whatever your next project is, having a well-tested, that you're familiar with, set of UI extensions for JavaScript will certainly save you some time. Now, on the Telerik extension side, some of the advantages are in fact, the server-side rendering. If you have not read my blog post, check out my blog, telerikewatch.com, and look for some of the blog posts I recently did on the advantages of server-side rendering, because it's often overlooked because we assume now, because JavaScript is so prolific, that you can use JavaScript without any penalty all the time. And generally that's true for users, but there are some very important so-called users of the web that don't execute JavaScript, at least not consistently today, and that is web indexers. Googlebot, the Yahoo indexers, the Microsoft indexers, they don't traditionally execute JavaScript. So if you have a UI or if you have anything that's built up using JavaScript, very likely it's not being indexed well. So it's important to have that easy to fall back on server-side rendering in your UI for indexing. A complete toolbox obviously saves you time. You have one set of tools to configure, and then they're easy to use all together. And support is obviously a big one as well. So support is the one thing where we get off the open source track and we start talking about what is Telerik actually, why are we actually giving this away for free and making it open source? Because obviously at the back end we have support, but having available support helps you in real-world projects, and obviously a roadmap for the future ensures that the tools you use aren't going to sit there and get stale or not be improved by somebody else if you don't want to take the time to do it yourself. Both are open source, though. Both are free. Both are lightweight and have client-side rendering, and both leverage Fluent API. So there are a lot of similarities between Telerik extensions and JavaScript UI components, but there are obviously advantages as well, which is why I think it's worth you checking them out, learning them, and trying them out in your projects. So what's available? What's in the toolbox that you can use? Well, the very first release, so we'll build up here on what's in the toolbox so you can get a sense of how it's built up. From the very first release, which was December of last year, Q3 2009 for Telerik, or November, we've had a grid, menu, panel bar, and tab strip. And grid obviously being one of those grounding controls, one of the major controls you always look for when you're often building applications. So it's been around from the beginning and it continues to be enhanced. So we'll spend some time looking at grid today, and obviously the navigation controls. We also added at that time the optimization controls, the script registrar and style sheet registrar, which we won't look at a lot today, but we'll touch on. From there, we've added the tree view, the date picker, calendar, and numeric input. Obviously, some more of the input controls you need. This also helps with data editing inside of a grid. And then today, bringing us all the way up to Q2 2010, you'll now find betas for these three tools plus, and I'll mention the beta roadmap. For the rich text editor, a window component, and a combo box. And I put an asterisk by combo box. It's really combo box, autocomplete box, and drop-down list, all for MVC. And a lot of new features in the grid, including hierarchy support, automatic edit forms, things that will help you build those richer views faster. So two more things, and then we'll jump into Visual Studio. First and foremost, MVC is about performance, so we've kept that in mind as we built out the Telerik extensions. So there's a very light client-side footprint. There's about a 4K, give or take. I need to double-check that, see where it's evolved to now, but a very small common Telerik JavaScript file that's used across all the UI extensions. And then for each extension, there are additional JavaScript files split logically based on both the controls and for controls that are big enough for some of the bigger features. So it allows you to only use the JavaScript you actually need. And when you're using the script registrar, you don't even have to go figure out which files that represents. The script registrar will automatically, based on the UI extensions you're using, register and then load the appropriate scripts. So it helps you reduce the amount of script you're using and load only what you need. And the script registrar goes as far as helping you combine, compress, cache, And even if you want to use the Telerik CDN, pull these resources from a CDN so that you can optimize these many scripts into single requests and make your app faster. And we talked about being built on a jQuery. So the Fluent API, what does it look like? And then we'll look at Visual Studio and how do you set up a project. Basically looks a little bit like this. All Telerik extensions hang off of the default HTML helper method inside of MVC. So in this case, you can see we're actually using, if you are paying attention closely, the response.write shorthand syntax, so % equals. And we're saying HTML.Telerik. Telerik is where you find all the Telerik extensions. And then in this case, I've grabbed the menu extension. I always need to set the name. The name is going to be the exact HTML control ID that renders to my page. In the case of something like menu, I can go ahead and add items. So I can add the items collection, define the text, and for most items, there's also a content template, which allows me to put any HTML I need in there, so I have complete control over the HTML, and then I can close the control. If I'm using this response.write syntax, I just close the control. It outputs it to the, obviously to the response stream by virtue of the ASP.NET syntax. I can leave the equals off and put a .render at the end if I would like as well, and .render at the point that is called will output to the response context. So two ways of outputting your controls. So let's take a look at this in Visual Studio so you can start to see some of this in action. So I'm going to jump over to a blank Visual Studio, which I think I've got here. Well, that one's not the blank one, so let's see if we can get this. This looks blank. So let me get this out of your way so you guys can see as much as possible. We're going to need this in just a moment, so I'm going to leave that. When you install the Telerik extensions, what you'll find with the latest release, and the latest release will be on CodeFlex as soon as we ship past the beta. We can talk about that difference at the end, but what you'll find is that there is a Visual Studio plugin to help you get your project set up if you don't want to go the manual route. So what the Visual Studio plugin will allow you to do is from the Telerik menu in Visual Studio, select MVC UI extensions, create a new Telerik project, and all this is going to do is create a new MVC2 web application project for me. So I'll go ahead and select this. And with my beta build, I'm going to use 3.5. There's a 4.0 issue that's been fixed in the next release build, but I've got a little issue here. I'm going to go to 3.5.4, and I'm going to go ahead and just leave the default name. It doesn't really matter. Click OK. And what this is going to do is, rather than just dumping me into my project, it's going to allow me to configure a few things via wizard and then create my project for me. So do I want to be a good boy and test my application? Well, no. Global resources, do I want to bring in the script files and CSS files I need? Do I want to bring in the editor templates? And this means the templates that I actually can use to, let's say, edit at a date time using the Telerik date picker. That will be automatically brought in. Do I want to take advantage of the Telerik CDN? For today, I'll say no, but obviously we could. All the resources available on the CDN. And then, do I want to allow the combining, the compressing of all the style sheets and scripts via my registrars? And I'll say sure, why not? And I can choose from any of the built-in themes. And there's another advantage of using the Telerik tools is you do have, I think it's now 14 or 12, somewhere in that range, built-in themes that you can apply for pixel-perfect CSS rendering, and you can customize these in our theme customizer, stylebuilder.telerik.com, to make them whatever you like if you don't like the hack CSS. So we'll click Finish, and what this will do is it'll automatically create my MVC project, add the necessary reference to telerik.web.mvc.dll, so add my assembly reference there. The namespace is .ui. It'll add the necessary namespaces to my web config, and it will also create the necessary files inside of my shared master view so I can use that as well. And it's running a little bit slow here. I think it's probably because of the environment we're in, but hopefully Visual Studio will catch up. So Visual Studio has created and copied the files. Let me show this to you so you have an understanding of what just happened in the automatic steps that just took place. We'll get that out of your way. And I've got Just Code installed here, so I've got this handy little come here and just collapse all, which will make it a lot easier to show you this. So we brought in our global resources. You can see we have localizations for all of the strings in the grid specifically today, so we've got that brought into our project. In our content folder and our scripts folder, you can see we brought in two folders, both with the version number for the assembly we're using. And this is where the Telerik extensions will automatically look for the necessary supporting files so that you can always be sure that, at least by default, unless you take manual control, it's going to go find the correct versions of the scripts that match the version of the assembly you're using. So in the content folder, we find all the different Telerik themes that are available, or skins for the controls. The skinning is set up such that there's one common CSS file that you always use, so this is your base style sheets, and then one style sheet for all tools for each of the different themes. And those style sheets provide the various tweaks required for the themes that you consume. And the folders simply have the CSS sprites, or the images that you need to support that theme. So in the default theme, for instance, we have a loading GIF, so we have to have that as a standalone file because animated editor has a lot of buttons, so there's one sprite for the editor toolbar buttons, and then the sprite PNG is all the rest of the icons you need for the controls and the backgrounds, simply sprited for optimization so you can use it in CSS. In the scripts folder, we have the supporting script files I talked about. By default, we bring in the minified versions of all these. You can find the non-minified versions if you'd like in the source directory when you install the files. And you can see we also give you jQuery in case you don't have it, so you can pull it from there, and then you can see that logical splitting down of files I talked about, breaking it into the small parts so that you can optimize how you include it in your project. If you were to do this manually, if you weren't to go the route where this brought this in for you, just to give you a quick heads up to that, all you need to do is go to your install directory for the Telerik extensions or wherever you've extracted the resources, and in there you'll find these folders. And you can see in the install folders, we've got a content folder and a scripts folder. If I open this up, you'd see here in the scripts folder, for instance, is exactly what we see in our project now. So if you were to do this manually, all you'd have to do is create your new MVC project, copy these contents of these two folders into your project, and then obviously from the binaries folder, whether you're using MVC 1 or 2, copy these files as well. And so we'll bring that into our project and we'll be set. So our reference has been added. Our web config has also been updated for us. It's important to see what happened in web config. Here we've added a section group, web assets, which actually allows us to do some configuration over how we optimize and group our web assets globally from web config. And then obviously we need to have, so we can work with Telerik extensions, and this is really the all-critical line in MVC, adding the namespace to our page namespaces in web config. This allows us to work with the Telerik extensions in an MVC view. So this is a very important line. And we'll leave that at that for now. We'll talk about something else in a minute. So that's the general project setup. Now let's look at the actual views that we're writing. So our master page, it's gone ahead and put a little bit of extra code in our master page for us, the two registrars we've talked about. One, the style sheet registrar, and you can see in this case for the style that we selected from the wizard, the Sitefinity style, which is just sort of a Sitefinity look and feel. We've added the common CSS and we've added the Sitefinity CSS. And you notice that in this case, we're actually just bringing in the .css, but if we were to look at the content folder, let's say for Sitefinity, you can see that it's min.css. Automatically, the style sheet registrar is going to look for either the non-minified or the minified version. So when it finds the minified version, it's going to use it, and it's going to know what path to look at as well. We're also saying in this case to go ahead and combine and compress all of our CSS. So while we have these two files in this CSS group, they're going to be sent to us as a single request, and they're going to be gzip compressed as well if the browser supports it. For the script registrar, we're doing something relatively similar. In this case, we are saying script registrar default group, go ahead and combine and compress the scripts as well. But really with script registrar, the only thing you ultimately have to do, if we were to get rid of the default group combining and compressing, is just telerik.scriptregistrar. Adding that to the bottom of your page, just for the closing body tag, will allow your UI extensions to automatically register themselves with the script registrar and then bring on the necessary JavaScript files you need. So this is the setup for your project. Once you have this, your project is set up to start working with the Telerik extensions. In fact, technically we already are using 2 of them. And in my view, I can now start creating these richer views. In fact, let's just use a basic extension now to get started. If I go to my home view, let's get rid of some of this default content. Go ahead and open up some tags. And in here, let's just go to HTML. Like I said, we should find the Telerik extension method if we've set up our project correctly. And I find in .NET 3.5 sometimes, for some reason, more often than .NET 4.0 with extension methods. Sometimes the project needs a quick build to find extension methods. So if you don't see it, try that. In this case, I don't think it does see it, so let's go ahead and try my own advice and see if we can get our project to catch up. So we'll do a quick build on our project, and that should trigger our extension method to show up in Visual Studio's IntelliSense. So there we go. So you can see the quick build solves the problem. So from the Telerik extension method, we see all the various available UI extensions we can use within our project. So if we're just going to use a basic one, let's just go ahead and use menu like I described before. So I'll say menu.name, give it a name, my menu. And then we need some items as well. So I'll say items, and here we're going to use lambda expressions. The syntax for configuring UI extensions is very fluid, and while it looks complex in its final state, as you can see with Visual Studio's IntelliSense, it really guides you through the process, and if you can just become comfortable with lambda expressions, then it really feels very natural and fluid. So in this case, I'm just going to use I to represent my items, and we're going to have an array of items, so I'm going to go ahead and create some brackets here, and I'm just going to say I.add, you can give my menu item some text, so let's just say about. Now, if I wanted to have sub-items so that my menu would drop down, I would just keep kind of chaining this together. So I could just go to its items collection. So I could say items on this. I could say, let's just say sub1. And I want a collection of items in here. I could say sub1 dot add text hello. And sub1 dot add text dot hi. Close this off, and let's just add one more item to our root menu, i.add.text.mvcconf, because that's where we all are. And I won't add any sub-items to this one. I'll just leave it at that. You can see you have a lot of options here, though. You can go ahead and make a menu item selected by default when you configure it here. You can specify the URL that it should direct to when it's clicked. You can do all kinds of things, changing HTML attributes directly from the Fluent API. So I'm using basic settings here, but obviously you have more options. And you can do the same for Telerik menu. In this case, you can see that we've only set up some items, but you have the option to configure, for instance, open on click or just open on hover. So you can come configure all of these things through the same API. Because I'm not using %equals here, the last thing I need to do then is call .render, which is going to take my output, spit it out to the response from my server, put it into my page. So I should now be able to browse this and see my menus. So let me go ahead and Control F5, and we'll take a look at this in the browser. Get the right path to my home view. So now we're on the right view. We see the menu here, and we can see that the slide-down menu works. This actually is the Sitefinity theme applied here. Menus is just very basic, and we can see our drop-down menu with a little bit of additional styling in our two items on hover. So the nice thing about this, few things. First of all, I was able to do it server-side, so I got all the IntelliSense help and all the things that can help me configure this quickly versus perhaps doing with JavaScript. And by using the script registrar and style sheet registrars, it automatically brought on the necessary style sheets and scripts I need to support menu. So if I was to go look at the page source for this, you know that I didn't automatically register the scripts for the menu. You saw the master page when we looked at it first. But you can see now that it's already brought on both jQuery, the common Telerik JavaScript file, and the Telerik menu file. It registered that, it knew that it needed those, and brought them on. If you're going to use jQuery in other spots in your file, you probably want to turn off the automatic addition of jQuery from the script registrar and add it manually to the page where you need it, especially if you're processing jQuery earlier in the page rendering. So that's something to be aware of, but it will bring it on for you automatically, so when you add your extensions, they just work. And if we look at the rendering of our menu, what's the rendering? It's semantic HTML. It's an unordered list of list items, and simply using CSS to do the styling. So we have CSS classes applied here, and obviously those can be customized to fit your application perfectly, either manually, if you prefer that approach, or in the style builder tool I mentioned. So very quickly now, we've got a project set up. We've got an extension displayed on our page. So we can go much deeper from here. So let's go then back and talk about how much deeper we can go. And we're going to focus on some of the major UI extensions to sort of give you that rounded out perspective of what you can do. And when we talk about major UI extensions with MVC especially, the first place you always have to start is with a grid. So the grid today for MVC supports out of the box paging, sorting, filtering, scrolling, grouping, and with the latest release, hierarchy, inline editing, pop-up edit forms, inline edit forms, and direct data binding to server-side data, so bound on the server, all HTML sent to the client. AJAX binding, so bound to a controller action result, and JSON is sent back, or bound directly to a web service, so a WCF or ASMX web service sending back the JSON and populating on the client. All those options are supported, and all can be configured directly from the syntax of the Fluent API. So very easy to set up these high-performance scenarios with the grid. So let's take a look at the grid so you can see this much more interesting to see live. And we'll go back to Visual Studio. I'll start by showing you a quick example of how you can add a grid to your project, and then I'll show you some existing demos so you can see some of the more features in action, since we don't have a lot of time today. So for simplicity and speed, I'm just going to come here and add a quick new link to SQL context, and clearly not necessarily what you want to use in a real project, but we're going for speed here today. And the famous Northwind database. And we're just going to use the customers table for now. So we'll come in here. In fact, yeah, we'll just use customers. So we'll come use customers, drag and drop it onto our context, save that, so we can now do some quick and dirty data access. So if I go to my home controller, let's just go ahead and send some some data to my view. I can go var context or DB, whichever you prefer, new Northwind data context, and we'll let VS catch up with me. And then we want to send some data back to our view. So in the simplest form, in the most unoptimized way, what can we do? We could say DB, if I can get my namespace using in here, db.customers, and we could really just leave it at that. But let's just be judicious and, well, we'll leave it at that so we can do some more configuration options. So we'll send our data to our view, quick and dirty, as I said, for demoing purposes here. And in our view, now we can bind to this data. Now, if we want to make our view strongly typed, we could actually do that as well. So we could actually come in here and make this a strongly typed view up at the top here, actually, so that we could then bind our grid directly to the model. In fact, just to show you how that works, come in here and we should be getting back, in this case, a linked table. So actually change that in a second. Let's just make this an iList of customer, and let's get our full namespace reference in here. What is it? It's Northwind something or other. Northwind.application.model. So I could add the using namespace to my web config to save me the need to do this, but we'll just go ahead and do that to save some time. And in my controller, rather than returning iQueryable, that's a linked table. I'll just go ahead and do this to list, again, to save me some typing. So we'll do that. And now in our view, let's go ahead and add our grid. And because we have a strongly typed view, we can actually just bind our grid to the model data. So let's just get rid of our menu here and instead add a grid. So I'll say telerik.grid. And in my grid, I'll bind directly to the model, so we can bind directly to the model's data type. It's going to get that type from our page declaration up above. We'll give this a name. We'll say my grid. And then I really don't need to do anything else. I can just output my grid at this point. It's going to automatically generate my columns, and it's going to give me the default features that it supports. So if we're to go back and view this in the browser, let's close our source and go back to our home page. We see that without filtering the columns down or doing anything else to make this look pretty, we get all of our customer records, and they're displayed here rendered as a grid. In fact, we can refresh this. In this case, it's going to refresh server binding, but at the very least, without much effort, we've got a grid on our page with our CSS theme applied, all that goodness. So if we want to make this a little bit more functional, do something more interesting than just displaying a table, which we easily do ourselves, now we can start adding functionality. So we can come down here and say, make it pageable, make it filterable, make it groupable. We can just start adding these things. Of course, there's configurability in here, so I can say, well, what do I want my page size to be? Well, then I can optionally come in and start defining some of those configuration options. So I can say page size equals, or page size, let's say 10. I can keep chaining together these methods in this Fluent API to do my configuration. So that now when I go back and view this in the browser, go back and reload this, now you can see my grouping area shows up here, so I can drag and group my columns. You can see my paging UI shown up, and I can, in fact, now page 1 to 2 to 3. You can see with server binding by default, we're updating our URLs. This is also what we could say SEO-friendly paging, in that this can be indexed, this link can be shared to the state of the grid. But we've now added all this functionality without really doing anything. In fact, we get filtering in here. I can come in and say, starts with a company name that starts with, let's say, M. And apply my filter, and you see we filter right down to those companies. So all that functionality now is built in. We're using Link, obviously, in the back end to make all this happen, but we can do that very quickly without needing to write a lot of code. It's giving us a lot of functionality without a lot of effort. Now, you can go a lot further than this, and I'd encourage you to go over to the demos.telerik.com/ASP.NET-MVC, and for the latest things, -beta. Again, we've got a little bit of a beta period here to look at the newest things, and you can start to see how you can do, for instance, beyond what we just did, we could do AJAX binding. So rather than doing server binding, now we configure the grid, and I'll show you the configuration approach. Now we use a data binding API to simply configure data binding with Ajax and then specify the select method if we're going to do data editing as well, the update, the insert method, and we're just passing here the name of the action and then the controller, and then we're going to route things to those. We're going to route that appropriately using the routing engine. In the controller to support Ajax binding, we're simply getting our model, and we're returning it in a new grid model. A grid model, in case you're thinking, okay, here's some magic that I shouldn't have to take on in my code, that's simply returning the collection that you need to display and the total page size, so that the grid can support paging past what's displayed. So you can do anything you want, even just write your own raw JSON return that has those two values, but grid models does it automatically for you on a collection, so just saving you some time. Grid action is doing something very similar, and that grid action is applying the appropriate filters that have been applied from the grid or sorting, whatever it may be, via link. So you can, again, do that on your own. It's just a way to decorate your actions and save you from having to do it on your own. But when we have Ajax binding, now you can see very fast, it's JSON back and forth, it's rendering on the client, and we're able to very quickly page through, sort, filter, all those things we want to do with our grid. If you want to go beyond just the data binding scenarios, obviously you can do editing as well. There's both server Ajax editing examples, same kind of thing we just looked at. Inline editing has been around since an early release. Our latest release, just so I can show it to you before our time expires, with inline form editing, now when I click edit for a record, the grid will actually help me automatically generate a form inline, in this case, for my rows, rather than just that typical inline approach. And it'll allow me to set up the editors. So in this case, we're using the numeric input extension from Telerik to edit this numeric data. And we're using the date picker to edit this date, automatically based on the templates that we provided when we set up our project. So this allows you to have that rich validation, that rich UI in your editing form automatically created by the grid so that you don't have to do it on your own. Can you create it on your own? Obviously, yes, but this is just saving you the time so that you can create these rich views quickly. The whole idea of what we're really talking about today. Hierarchy is also a new feature, so let me quickly introduce that to you as well. Hierarchy in the grid is supported via a very simple API, and it really gives you ultimate flexibility. In the grid API, there's now a detail view configuration option, and in detail view, there's a template, and in the template, you can put whatever you want. So if you want to put additional grids that in turn have additional detail views, you can support unlimited levels of hierarchy. If you prefer to put something more custom inside that detail view, you can as well. So here you can see we've configured 3 levels of hierarchy, drilling down into from our employees to our orders to the products. But we could just as easily come in here and put a tab in the first level. So we drill down from employee, we find a tab, and then within the tab we find maybe detailed information about their contacts and the orders grid as well. So it's a very flexible approach to hierarchy, but allows you to very quickly and easily add that in an MVC view. Obviously, lots of additional demos here. I encourage you to check them out, but our time is so short today. Let me just quickly highlight some additional things. I want to make sure you're aware of the editor, because the editor is brand new for MVC, and it's a very powerful foundational start. Now, we clearly don't have a lot of the tools that you'll need in the final version of this, but in the beta and in version 1, what we're really aiming to do is deliver identical HTML output across all browsers. No questions, no exceptions. And part of the way we're achieving this that's different than a lot of the rich text editors take, including our own Red Ajax phrase done at Ajax, is that we're not using the browser-provided rich text engines, which is often where you get into the scenario where different HTML is generated. Instead, we're building from the ground up an engine to process your HTML and ensure that it's output the same across all browsers. So it's taking us a little more time up front, but it's ensuring that the foundations are very solid for consistent output. Today, there's support for text formatting and alignment, bulleted and numbered lists, very basic hyperlink and image dialogues, all easy to configure via the API, and gives you an option for adding native rich text editing to MVC. Clearly just a foundational start today. And I'll show you a demo on that in just a minute. In addition to the combo box and window, the other 3 new things in this latest release, all available in the demo site I just showed you. I encourage you to play around with it, but since we started a little late and since we have very little time, let me first talk about licensing so you can get that. So the question I've even seen on Twitter today, and I know lots of people have, is, great, fine, is this a commercial or is this actually free and available to me? Well, the answer is it's absolutely free and available to you. It is open source. It's on Codeplex, Telerik, ASP.NET, MVC.codeplex.com, and it's licensed under GPL v2. So some people at this point rear back and say, GPL v2, why not something more permissive and open? Well, because frankly we think GPL v2 is the most true to the sense open source license out there, in the sense that When you're building free software or building software for your own internal use, then great. These tools are perfect for you. If you're building an internal app on MVC, use the MVC extensions for free, go to town, have a great time. If you're building software that's for the open source community, such as maybe the MVC Conf website, use these tools for free, release it, great, no problems. But if you're trying to make money off your software, ultimately, Telerik and all of our developers and all our staff worldwide are trying to do the same thing. So that's where the commercial license comes in. You only need the commercial license if you're trying to sell and make money off your software. It's sort of a logical step. The other benefit of the commercial license, if you need it, is obviously our guaranteed Telerik support. So our support has something of a legendary reputation for helping you through tough spots. So if you want priority access to that outside of the forums, that's what a commercial license gains you, in addition to the regular service pack and hotfix updates. For just the overhead, we update the Codeplex project with every major release, and then we ship service packs and hotfixes in between to the commercial licenses. But again, it's just for an overhead thing. They are the same exact controls in both the open source and the commercial branch. We're not forking this to be a premium branch and a non-premium branch, same tools. It's just a matter of whether you need that faster access to support and hotfixes, which obviously is more overhead for us, which is why we have the commercial license. So hopefully that helps explain it. I encourage you guys to be ambassadors of the licensing for the Teller extensions for MVC. Help people understand that these are truly, in fact, open source tools. And if you're building internal apps, you're not trying to sell your apps, perfectly safe to use, open source and free, and have at it. Have a great time. We want your feedback. We want you to consume them. And in terms of where we're going from what you see now, obviously there are 4 components I mentioned that are beta today. We'll be shipping the official version of those components in about a month. So about 3 or 4 weeks from now, towards mid to late August, we'll be shipping the final versions of what you see today. And if you want to provide input on that, download, play with it today, send us your feedback through the forums or email me so we can make those perfect for the official release. And then for the next version, as we head to the end of the year, we'll continue to add to this toolbox, growing this toolbox to make you more productive so that you guys can be super productive MVC developers. So to sum up this presentation, so I can hopefully look at least 1 or 2 questions, MVC is a solution for developers with a problem being obviously web pages that are too heavy, URLs that they want to be clean, and it inherently, out of the box, requires developers to write more code. That's actually a good thing for a lot of developers. So what we're trying to do is reduce the time you spend writing view code so that you can maximize the time you spend writing controller or domain code more importantly. So the result should be that you save time, you improve your application quality, and we can continue to evolve the web together to have those clean URLs, the clean content, and remain productive developers building rich views for the web. And the MVC extensions, we think, are great open source tools to help you do that. The call to action, go to Telerik mvc.codeplex.com, download the extensions for MVC today, try them out, share them with your friends. You can also visit Telerik.com, obviously, to grab them as well if you prefer. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me, anglin@telerik.com, or on Twitter, @ToddAnglin. Be happy to answer those for you.
This presentation was recorded at MVC Conf. For more content like this, go to www.mvcconf.com.